"Your 9 o'clock is on the terrace, sir," murmured Elena, his assistant, materializing beside him with a tablet glowing with schedules and stock tickers. Raphael didn't turn. "Cancel it. I'm not in the mood for small talk today." A flicker of hesitation crossed Elena's face. "It's the Singapore investors. They flew in specifically. I said cancel it." His voice remained calm, measured, but carried the weight of a closing door. He finally turned, eyes scanning the grand staircase as if assessing an asset. "If they want my time, they'll wait. Everything here waits for me." Upstairs, a soft melody drifted from the east wing. Clara practicing Chopin on the Steinway she'd requested years ago. Raphael's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He loved the music, but lately it felt like an intrusion, a reminder of a life that existed parallel to his ambitions rather than in service of them. He climbed the stairs 2 at a time, the rhythm of his footsteps swallowing the delicate notes. He found her bathed in golden light, fingers dancing across ivory keys, eyes closed as if in prayer. For a heartbeat, something tender stirred in his chest. The ghost of the man he'd been when he first met her, the man who'd been captivated by her quiet strength. Then she opened her eyes and saw him in the doorway, and the spell broke. "You're home early," she said, her hands still resting on the keys. The markets were kind today. He moved to the window, gazing out at the infinity pool merging with the horizon. "I've been thinking. We should host the Henderson Gala here next month. Make a statement." Clara's smile was gentle but didn't reach her eyes. "The gardens aren't ready. And you know I've never enjoyed those events." "It's not about enjoyment," he replied, turning to face her. "It's about presence. People need to see us together. They need to see what I've built." A silence stretched between them, thin and fragile. She finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "What you've built, or what we've built." Raphael's smile was polite, dismissive. "Semantics, my love. The foundation, the permits, the capital, all flowed through my hands. This house stands because I willed it into existence." He gestured broadly, encompassing the vaulted ceilings, the imported chandeliers, the panoramic view of the coastline. "Every stone, every beam answers to me." Clara rose slowly from the piano bench, smoothing her linen dress. "The land beneath those stones has its own history, Raphael. Longer than any of us." He laughed, a short, dry sound. "Land is just dirt until someone gives it purpose. I gave this place purpose. I gave us purpose." He stepped closer, cupping her chin with practiced tenderness that felt more like possession. "Don't lose sight of that. Never forget who holds the keys to this kingdom." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she placed her hand over his, her touch feather-light. "I remember everything," she said softly. "Every promise. Every sunrise we watched from this window. I remember who I married." For a fleeting second, doubt flickered in his gaze, a shadow crossing the sun. Then it vanished, replaced by the familiar armor of certainty. He kissed her forehead, a gesture both affectionate and final. "Good. Then you understand why everything must align with my vision now. No distractions. No sentimentality." As he walked away, Clara remained by the piano, her fingers tracing the edge of the music stand. Outside, a lone gardener knelt near the property's ancient stone boundary marker, brushing away moss to reveal faded lettering beneath. Clara watched him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she turned back to the silent piano, pressing a single key whose note hung in the air like a question waiting to be answered. Downstairs, Raphael poured himself a whiskey, unaware that the foundation beneath his feet held secrets far older, and far more powerful, than his fortune. The mansion stood tall against the sky, beautiful and unshakable. But foundations, he would soon learn, are not always what they appear to be. And ownership. Ownership is a story told the color of wheat at sunset, hands that knew soil better than silk. "Señora Clara?" A soft voice came from the doorway. Maria, the housekeeper for 30 years, stood holding a tray with chamomile tea. The same blend Clara's grandmother had grown in this very soil. "You didn't come down for lunch." Clara turned, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I wasn't hungry, Maria." Maria set the tray on a side table, her gaze lingering on Clara's face with a tenderness reserved only for family. "He was sharp with you again this morning. I heard the tone from the kitchen." "It's nothing," Clara whispered, though her fingers trembled as she lifted the teacup. "He's under pressure. The markets." "Pressure doesn't erase kindness," Maria said gently, her Portuguese accent softening the edges of truth. She moved to the window, pointing toward the far edge of the property where the manicured lawns gave way to wild olive groves. Do you remember when you were 7? You fell from that old fig tree near the boundary stones. Scraped your knee so badly you cried for an hour. Clara's breath caught. You carried me all the way back to the farmhouse. Abuela was so angry at me for climbing. Not at you, Maria corrected, her eyes glistening. At me for not watching closer. She said, this land has held our family through wars and droughts. It will hold her, too, but she must learn to listen to it first. Maria turned to Clara, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Your grandmother didn't just give you this land in her will, Minha querida. She entrusted you with its memory, with its voice. Clara set down the cup, tea untouched. Raphael thinks this is all his creation. The mansion, the vineyards, the helipad, he points to them like trophies. But he's never once asked why the boundary stones have those strange carvings. Or why the well in the east garden never runs dry, even in drought. Because he sees dirt, Maria said softly. You see ancestors. A memory surfaced unbidden. Clara at 16, walking this land with her grandmother as the old woman pressed a weathered hand against the largest boundary stone. Feel this, Clara, Abuela had said, her voice like dry leaves. The stone is cold, but underneath, feel the warmth? That's the heart of the land. It remembers every footstep, every promise made upon it. Someday, Mija, you'll stand here as its guardian, not its owner. There's a difference. Now, standing in a mansion built atop those same promises, Clara felt the irony like a stone in her throat. Raphael had swept in 10 years ago, a brilliant, hungry architect with fire in his eyes and nothing to his name but ambition. He'd fallen in love with her quiet strength, or so he claimed. But he'd fallen harder for the rolling hills she'd shown him on their third date, not knowing they were hers to show. I should have told him, Clara murmured, more to herself than Maria. When he first proposed building here, I should have said the land was in my family. Maria shook her head slowly. Would he have listened? Or would he have seen it as leverage? A bargaining chip? She touched Clara's shoulder, her palm rough from decades of work. You stayed silent to protect something purer than deeds and titles. You wanted him to love the land for itself, not for what it could give him. Tears welled but didn't fall. Clara walked to a small writing desk tucked beside the piano, a humble piece of furniture Raphael had called quaint, but never bothered to replace. She opened the bottom drawer, fingers brushing against a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. Her grandmother's handwriting danced across the envelopes in elegant script. He asked me last week why I spend so much time in the East Garden, Clara said, unfolding one letter. I told him I liked the light. But the truth is, this is where Abuela taught me to read the soil, where she buried her wedding ring after Abuelo died, not as loss, but as promise. What grows from grief, she said, is stronger than what grows from joy. Maria watched her carefully. He's planning something big, isn't he? I overheard the lawyers yesterday. Something about expanding the foundation toward the olive groves. Clara's blood ran cold. The olive groves, where the oldest boundary stone stood, carved with her family's crest. Where Abuela's ashes were scattered beneath the oldest tree. He doesn't know what he's touching, Clara whispered, clutching the letter. He thinks he can reshape everything to his design. But some roots go too deep to cut. Downstairs, a car door slammed. Raphael's voice carried up the stairwell, sharp, impatient, barking orders into his phone about structural assessments and soil surveys. Clara closed her eyes, listening to the rhythm of his ambition echoing through halls built on her inheritance. She thought of the boundary stone, of Abuela's hands pressing into the earth, of promises whispered into soil that remembered every word. Maria squeezed her hand. The land knows its guardian, Clara. It always has. Clara nodded slowly, a quiet resolve settling in her chest like a seed finding fertile ground. She looked toward the window where Raphael's shadow moved across his study glass. A king in his castle, unaware that castles built on borrowed ground tremble first when the truth rises. She would not fight him with anger. She would wait, because the deepest truths, like the oldest roots, reveal themselves in their own time. And when they did, no amount of money could silence what the earth itself would testify. She picked up her teacup at last, the chamomile steam warming her face like a blessing. Somewhere beyond the mansion walls, a breeze stirred the olive leaves, a sound like pages turning in a story Raphael had never bothered to e-page. Those petals have more dimension than the architecture students produce all semester, a voice said, confident, curious, edged with hunger. She'd looked up to find Raphael standing there, 28 and vibrating with restless energy, his suit jacket slung over one shoulder despite the heat. His eyes didn't just see her. They assessed, calculated, recognized potential. "You're an architect?" she'd asked, closing her notebook instinctively. "I will be," he corrected with a smile that held no arrogance yet, only certainty. "Right now I'm a waiter who draws buildings on napkins." But not for long. He'd sat beside her without invitation, and when he spoke of light and space and the poetry of steel, something in Clara unclenched. She'd grown up listening to land speak in rustling leaves and shifting soil. Raphael spoke of human dreams made tangible in glass and concrete. Opposite languages, yet both about belonging. Their first real conversation stretched into evening. He confessed he'd noticed her weeks earlier, always alone with her sketchbook, always observing. "You see what others walk past," he'd said, and the accuracy of it startled her. "I see what stays," she'd replied, softly, while everyone else watches what moves. He'd taken her hand then, his palm rough with calluses from construction jobs. "Show me what stays, Clara. Teach me." The memory dissolved as Raphael's voice cut through the present, sharp, impatient, from the hallway. "Clara, are you up here brooding again?" He appeared in the doorway, loosening his tie, the Singapore investors apparently forgotten. His gaze swept the room. The piano, the untouched tea, Maria's retreating back, and settled on her with practiced concern that never quite reached his eyes. "You missed lunch," he said, stepping closer. "And you've been quiet all week. Is it the Henderson Gala? I can postpone." "No," she interrupted gently. "It's not the gala." He sat beside her on the piano bench, the leather sighing under his weight. For a moment, the man she'd fallen for surfaced. The one who'd held her hand through her grandmother's funeral, who'd listened for hours as she described the scent of rain on dry earth. The man who'd whispered against her temple on their wedding night. "Your roots make me want to grow deeper." "What is it then?" he asked, thumb stroking her wrist. A gesture that once felt like sanctuary, now felt like inventory. Clara looked at their joined hands, remembering another evening 10 years ago. She'd just inherited the land after Abuela's passing. A sprawling, unassuming property everyone called charming but impractical. Raphael had been working 70-hour weeks, surviving on instant coffee and ambition. "I could sell it," she'd mused aloud that night, stirring soup on a humble stove. "The money would help you start your firm sooner." He'd set down his blueprints, eyes blazing. "Never. This land, it's sacred. It's where you come from. We'll build our future here, a home that honors both our dreams." Tears had welled in her eyes then. "You'd really build here?" "With no guarantee the firm will succeed." He'd cupped her face, voice thick with emotion. "Your faith in me is the only guarantee I need. This land isn't just dirt to me, Clara. It's the foundation of US." Now, sitting beside him in a mansion that cost more than most small countries' GDPs, Clara felt the ghost of that promise like a splinter under her skin. "Raphael," she began carefully, "do you remember our third date? When I brought you here for the first time?" He smiled, distracted, scrolling through emails on his phone. "How could I forget? You walked me through those olive groves like a priestess showing me holy ground. I'd never seen you so alive. I told you my family had lived here for generations," she pressed softly. "I showed you the boundary stones." His thumb stilled on her wrist. "You did. And I told you then, I'd honor that history. Build something worthy of it." He finally looked up, eyes narrowing slightly. "Why are we revisiting this now?" "Because sometimes I wonder if you remember why you chose this place," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Or if you only remember what you built upon it." The phone clattered onto the bench between them. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing," she said quickly, retreating. "I'm just nostalgic." "Nostalgia is a luxury for people who aren't building futures," he said, not unkindly, but with the finality of a judge's gavel. He stood, straightening his cuffs. "I have a call with Zurich in 20 minutes. Try to rest, Clara. You've been sentimental lately." As he left, Clara remained on the bench, the ghost of his touch burning on her skin. She remembered the night he'd proposed, not with a ring, but with blueprints spread across her kitchen table. "This is where our home will stand," he'd said, finger tracing a spot near the old well. "Our life, our legacy." She'd cried happy tears, believing his vision included hers. Only later did she realize he'd never asked permission, never consulted her about design or placement. He'd simply assumed, because she was gentle, because she deferred to his expertise, that her inheritance was his to shape. Maria reappeared quietly, placing a fresh cup of tea beside her. He doesn't remember the fig tree, does he? Clara shook her head, tears finally spilling. The day he proposed, I took him to the old fig tree where Abuela carved our initials after Grandpa proposed to her. I told him it was tradition, to mark love where roots ran deepest. He kissed me. But the next morning, he told the landscapers to remove the tree. Said its roots threatened the foundation. Maria's hand covered hers. And you said nothing. What could I say? He'd already poured millions into permits. He saw a dying tree. I saw generations of love. She wiped her cheeks with trembling hands. I thought compromise was love, that stepping back made space for his dreams. But somewhere along the way, I disappeared into his shadow. Downstairs, Raphael's voice rose in frustration during his Zurich call. No, the East Wing expansion is non-negotiable. We break ground next month regardless of soil reports. Each word a hammer blow against the land's silent history. Clara rose and walked to the window, watching dusk settle over the olive groves. She thought of all the ways she'd shrunk herself to fit his vision. Silencing her opinions at dinner parties, abandoning her botanical illustrations to manage his social calendar, accepting his practical dismissal of her family traditions as charming but irrelevant. The deepest betrayal hadn't been his ambition. It had been her own silence, choosing peace over truth, until peace became a gilded cage. But as the last light caught the ancient boundary, stone in the distance, Clara felt something shift inside her. Not anger, not vengeance, but the quiet certainty of tectonic plates realigning after centuries of pressure. The land remembered its guardian. And guardians, she realized, do not ask permission to protect what they love. She turned from the window, her reflection now clear in the darkening glass. Not a ghost in her own home, but a woman standing at the threshold of reckoning. Somewhere below, Raphael laughed at a joke on his call, unaware that the foundation beneath his feet held not just soil and stone, but a story waiting than she preferred. She accepted compliments with practiced smiles while her fingers traced the stem of her wineglass, counting seconds until she could retreat to the east garden. "Darling, the van der Linde consortium is here," Raphael murmured, materializing at her elbow with 2 fresh flutes. His grip on her waist was proprietary, fingers pressing just shy of discomfort. Remember, warm but distant. They respect mystery more than accessibility. "I remember," she said softly, accepting the glass. He studied her face, his smile not reaching his eyes. "You're pale. Smile like you mean it. These people decide whether our Singapore venture gets funded." Before she could respond, a booming laugh cut through the string quartet's melody. Arthur Finch, silver-haired titan of old money, known for brutal honesty, clapped Raphael on the shoulder hard enough to make him stumble. "Raphael, still standing on the most valuable dirt in the county, I see." Arthur's eyes twinkled with mischief as he turned to Clara. "Your grandmother was a visionary, my dear. Bought this land for pennies when everyone called it worthless scrub. Smartest investment I ever witnessed." Raphael's smile tightened at the edges. "The land was potential. I transformed potential into legacy." Of course. Arthur waved a dismissive hand, already turning toward the caviar station. "But let's be honest. Nobody builds a billion-dollar empire on rocky soil without first owning the soil itself. Luck plays its part." He winked at Clara. "Some of us marry well." The words hung in the air like shattered glass. Raphael's knuckles whitened around his champagne flute. Clara felt the temperature drop 10 degrees. "Excuse us," Raphael said through clenched teeth, steering her toward the terrace with a hand rigid at her back. The Mediterranean night air should have been a relief, but the terrace felt like a cage. Below, the infinity pool mirrored a sky choked with stars. Stars that had watched Clara's ancestors till this soil long before concrete foundations scarred the earth. "You heard him," Raphael hissed, voice low and venomous. "He thinks I'm a fortune hunter. That I married you for this land." Clara turned to face him, heart hammering against her ribs. "Arthur speaks without thinking. Everyone knows your talent. Do they?" He spun toward her, eyes blazing with a humiliation so raw it frightened her. "For 10 years I've built an empire from nothing. 10 years of 80-hour weeks while you sketched flowers and talked to gardeners. And still, they reduce me to a man who married up." "This isn't about marrying up," she whispered, tears pricking her eyes. "It's about partnership. You chose this land because you loved what it represented. I chose it because it was available," he snapped, then immediately regretted the words. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing the stone terrace like a caged animal. "God, Clara, look at you. You stand there in that dress I bought you, sipping champagne from glasses I selected, living in a home I designed. And you still act like a visitor in your own life. Like none of this touches you. Because it doesn't feel like mine. The confession tore from her throat before she could stop it. You designed every room without asking my opinion. You removed the fig tree where my grandparents carved their initials. You call this our home, but you've never once asked why the well in the east garden never runs dry, or why the boundary stones have carvings. Because those things don't matter, he exploded, then lowered his voice as guests drifted near the terrace doors. What matters is perception. What matters is that when Arthur Finch looks at us, he sees a power couple, not a man who got lucky with real estate. A couple emerged onto the terrace, laughing, oblivious, and Raphael instantly transformed. His posture straightened, smile blooming like sunrise. Julian, so glad you could make it. Clara was just telling me how much she admired your wife's foundation work. He squeezed Clara's hand, a warning grip. She forced a smile as Julian's wife gushed about orphanages in Nairobi. Clara nodded, responded appropriately, all while feeling Raphael's eyes on her like a surveillance camera. When the couple finally retreated indoors, the mask fell. You see? Raphael's voice was dangerously calm. That's how you engage. Present. Polished. Not drifting through rooms like a melancholy poet. I'm not melancholy, she said, the words tasting like ash. I'm homesick. For what? That crumbling farmhouse you lived in before we married? The one with the leaky roof and outdoor plumbing. For the woman I was before I started shrinking myself to fit your world. The words hung between them, trembling and true. Raphael went very still. The party noise faded to a distant hum. For the first time in years, Clara saw not the billionaire titan, but the hungry architect from the plaza, vulnerable, exposed, terrified of being seen as less than. You think I don't know? What people whisper, he said quietly, each word measured in cold. That I'm a brilliant decorator who married the landowner's granddaughter? That my success is built on dirt I didn't earn. He stepped closer, his breath warm against her cheek. Every time you retreat into your silence, every time you look at this mansion like it's a gilded cage, you confirm their suspicions. You make me look weak. Tears streamed freely down Clara's face now, but she didn't wipe them away. I never wanted to make you look weak. I wanted to build something real with you. But real things require truth, and you've built your entire identity on a lie you tell yourself every morning. That you created everything here from nothing. The terrace doors swung open. Elena appeared, face pale. Sir, the Singapore investors just arrived. They're asking for a private tour of the East Wing expansion plans. Raphael didn't take his eyes off Clara. Tell them I'll be there in 5 minutes. When they were alone again, he reached out, not to touch her, but to adjust the strap of her dress where it had slipped. His fingers brushed her shoulder, and she flinched. That flinch shattered something between them. His hand dropped. The warmth in his eyes evaporated, replaced by something glacial and final. You know what the problem is, Clara? You've never truly believed in me. Not the way I believed in myself. You see this mansion and think of lost trees and buried rings. I see it and think of every obstacle I overcame to give you this life. He stepped back, putting distance between them that felt geological. Perhaps we've been speaking different languages all along. He turned toward the doors, then paused without looking back. When you're ready to stand beside me as my equal, not as a ghost mourning a past I never promised to preserve, my office door is open. Until then, don't embarrass me in front of my guests. He disappeared inside, leaving Clara alone on the terrace with the stars and the sea and the crushing weight of a decade's silence. Below, the mansion glowed against the darkness, a monument to ambition built on land that remembered every promise ever broken upon it. She pressed her palm against the cool stone railing, feeling the vibration of music and laughter through the granite. And beneath that vibration, faint but undeniable, she felt something else, the slow, patient pulse of earth waiting to reclaim what was always its own. Inside, Raphael accepted congratulations from the Singapore investors, his smile flawless, his handshake firm. But when he glanced toward the terrace doors, his eyes held a fracture no one else could see. A hairline crack in the foundation of a man who had just realized the woman he loved saw him, not as her during the final toast, when he'd raised his glass to visionaries who build legacies. His eyes had swept past her, as if she were part of the decor. When his study light finally clicked off at 2:17 a.m., she knew sleep would be impossible. She changed into simple linen trousers and a cotton blouse, the clothes she wore when tending the East Garden, and carried her grandmother's letters downstairs to the library. Moonlight pooled on the Persian rug as she untied the ribbon, her fingers tracing Abuela's looping script. Ownership is not written in deeds, Mija, but in the willingness to listen when the land speaks. A floorboard creaked behind her. She didn't turn. I thought you'd be asleep. Raphael stood in the doorway, fully dressed despite the hour, his tie loosened but still knotted. A man preparing for war, not rest. He held 2 crystal tumblers and a bottle of single malt, but set them down untouched on the mantelpiece. We need to talk, he said. His voice was unnervingly calm, stripped of the gala's fury, polished to something colder. Clara closed the letters gently. I've been waiting. He walked to the fireplace, staring at cold ashes. Arthur Finch called me an hour ago. Apologized for his indiscreet comment about luck and land. A bitter smile touched his lips. He meant well, but it crystallized something I've been avoiding. He turned to face her, eyes reflecting moonlight like shards of ice. For 10 years, I've carried the weight of proving I earned this life. Every contract, every expansion, every headline, I built it to silence the whispers. And you, he paused, jaw tightening. You've become the living embodiment of those whispers. Her breath caught. I've never whispered anything against you. No, but your silence speaks louder. He took a step closer, hands clasped behind his back. The posture of a CEO delivering bad news to shareholders. When you look at this house and see only what was lost, when you flinch at my touch like I'm contaminating something pure, you confirm every insecurity I've fought to bury. You make me feel like a trespasser in my own creation. Tears welled, but she refused to let them fall. This was never about trespassing. It was about partnership. I wanted to build with you. You wanted to preserve a museum, he interrupted softly, the quietness more devastating than shouting. A shrine to a past I was never part of. While I was securing investors in Tokyo, you were measuring the circumference of olive trees. While I was negotiating mergers, you were pressing wildflowers into books. He shook his head, not with anger but with profound weariness. We're not building a life together, Clara. We're curating parallel existences under one roof. And I can't carry both our dreams anymore. Silence stretched between them, thick with the ghosts of 10 years. Somewhere outside, an owl called. A sound Abuela had said meant the land was listening. Are you asking me to leave? Clara whispered, the words tasting like broken glass. Raphael's gaze dropped to the floor, and in that moment she saw the boy from the plaza, the one who'd drawn buildings on napkins, hungry and hopeful. Then he lifted his chin, and the billionaire was back, armor reforged. I'm acknowledging a truth we've both avoided, he said, voice steady but hollow. There's no longer space for you here. Not because I don't value you, but because this space was designed for a woman who believes in my vision completely. And you. He met her eyes, and the pain there was genuine, raw. You believe in the land more than you believe in us. And I can't compete with ghosts. The words landed not as an attack, but as a verdict, delivered with surgical precision, leaving no room for negotiation. Clara felt the floor tilt beneath her. This wasn't rage. This was something far more final. Resignation dressed as rationality. I see, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. And when would you like me to go? Tomorrow, he said without hesitation. Elena will arrange a car. You may take anything that belonged to you before we married. The jewelry your grandmother left you, your books, your art supplies. The rest. He gestured vaguely at the room. The rest was purchased with company funds. It stays. A strange calm settled over her. She thought of Maria's words. The land knows its guardian. She thought of the boundary stone waiting in the olive grove, of Abuela's ashes nourishing roots deeper than any foundation. I won't take the car, she said softly. I'll walk. Raphael blinked, confusion breaking through his composure. Walk. It's 3 miles to the nearest. I know the paths better than anyone, she interrupted gently. I walked them long before your mansion stood here. I'll be fine. He stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. Not the quiet wife who deferred to his expertise, but a woman rooted in something older and stronger than his ambitions. For a heartbeat, she saw doubt flicker in his eyes. Then it vanished, replaced by the cold certainty of a man protecting his empire. Suit yourself, he said, turning toward the door. His hand paused on the brass knob. Clara, this isn't punishment. It's clarity. Sometimes love means recognizing when 2 people are building toward different horizons. Sometimes love means listening when the land speaks, she replied, her voice barely audible. He didn't respond. The door clicked shut with finality. Alone in the moonlit library, Clara gathered her grandmother's letters and tied them with the ribbon. She didn't pack a suitcase, didn't weep into silk pillows. Instead, she walked to the east wing, slipped through the French doors into the garden, and stood barefoot on soil that had known her family's footsteps for generations. Above, Raphael's shadow moved past the master bedroom window, a king surveying his kingdom. Unaware the ground beneath his throne held a secret that would soon rewrite every title deed he possessed. She knelt, pressing her palm into the earth. The soil was cool and alive beneath her skin. And as dawn began to blush at the edges of the sky, Clara felt it. Not a tremor, not a sound, but a certainty rising from the depths. The land was waiting. Not for revenge, not for justice, but for its guardian to remember her voice. Inside the mansion, Raphael poured 3 fingers of whiskey and stared at the blueprints for the East Wing expansion. Plans that would uproot the oldest olive tree on the property, the one beneath which Abuela's ashes rested. He didn't know that by tomorrow afternoon, a registered letter would arrive from the county land office, its contents simple and devastating. A notice of title verification regarding Parcel 7B, the legal designation for the soil his mansion stood upon. He didn't know that Clara's departure wasn't an ending, but an awakening. And he certainly didn't know that as he drank alone in his glass-walled study, the woman he'd just exiled was walking barefoot through dew-kissed grass toward a truth that would shatter his world without raising a single voice in anger. The first bird began to sing. Clara took a deep breath, tasting earth and salt air and the faint promise of rain. She turned her back on the mansion and walked toward the olive groves, each step lighter than the last. Behind her, the sun of recognition. The earth remembered her. Dew soaked the hem of her linen trousers, cold against her ankles, but she welcomed the sensation, a baptism of sorts. Behind her, the mansion stood silhouetted against the brightening sky, all sharp angles and imported stone, beautiful and alien. She didn't look back. At the property's eastern edge, where manicured lawns surrendered to wild olive groves, Maria waited beneath the oldest tree, its gnarled branches heavy with silver-green leaves. She held a woven basket lined with a faded quilt Clara recognized instantly. Abuela's wedding blanket, stitched with olive branches by her great-grandmother. "You walked," Maria said softly, no surprise in her voice. She'd known Clara since she was born in the farmhouse that once stood where Raphael's infinity pool now shimmered. "I told him I would." Clara's voice was raw but steady. She stopped before the boundary stone, its surface worn smooth by centuries of rain and touch. She placed her palm flat against the cool granite, feeling the faint carving of her family's crest beneath her fingers, the intertwined olive branches that had marked this land since 1842. Maria opened the basket. Inside lay Clara's true possessions. The leather-bound sketchbook filled with wildflower studies, the silver locket containing Abuela's photograph, a bundle of dried lavender from last summer's harvest, and the small wooden box holding her grandmother's letters. No jewelry from Raphael's vaults. No designer dresses. Only what had belonged to her before ambition entered their lives. "He called me at 4 a.m., Maria murmured, watching Clara trace the stone's carvings. "Raphael." Voice tight with something I've never heard before, not anger. "Fear. He asked if you'd come to my cottage." She paused. "I told him no, that you'd vanished into the olive groves like mist." Clara finally turned, tears glistening but not falling. "Why would he care where I went?" He made his position clear. "Because kings notice when their kingdoms grow quiet," Maria said gently. "And this land has gone very quiet since you left the mansion." A breeze stirred the leaves overhead, carrying the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine, the perfume of home. Clara sank onto the mossy ground beside the stone, the weight of the night settling in her bones. "He said there's no longer space for me there, that I believe in ghosts more than in us." Her voice cracked. "But I never stopped believing in him, Maria. I believed in the man who sketched buildings on napkins. The man who held my hand at Abuela's funeral and promised to honor her memory. When did he become someone who sees land only as leverage?" Maria sat beside her, their shoulders touching like they had when Clara was 7, and scraped her knee on this very stone. "He didn't become him overnight, Minha querida. Ambition is a slow poison. It starts with wanting more, then needing more, then forgetting why you wanted anything at all." She took Clara's hand, her palm rough with decades of work. "Do you remember the night he proposed? You came to me crying, not from joy but fear. You said, 'He loves the idea of this land more than the land itself.' I told you to trust love's capacity to deepen. But some roots, she added softly, refuse to intertwine. They grow parallel until one finally blocks the other's sun. Clara leaned her head on Maria's shoulder, the simple comfort unraveling her composure. Sobs came then, not dramatic or performative, but deep, shuddering waves of grief for a decade of swallowed words, for fig trees cut down without consultation, for well water never tasted because Raphael preferred imported mineral water in crystal glasses, for the slow erosion of a self she'd sacrificed to become the wife of a titan. I kept waiting for him to see, she whispered between tears, to notice how I'd light up when describing the soil's composition after rain, or how the East Garden's well water has a sweetness no bottled water replicates. I thought if I just loved him enough, he'd eventually care about what mattered to me. She wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand. But he only ever loved the version of me that reflected his success back at him. Maria wrapped the quilt around Clara's shoulders. And now, Clara looked toward the mansion, now glowing amber in the morning light. She felt no hatred, only a profound sadness. For him, for the dreams they'd mistaken for shared when they'd always been parallel. Now I understand Abuela's warning. Never build your home on someone else's foundation, even if they offer you the top floor. I gave him my land, but kept my heart in the soil beneath it. And soil, she said, pressing her palm into the earth beside the stone, always reclaims what belongs to it. They sat in silence as the sun climbed higher, painting the olive leaves in gold. Maria finally rose, offering a hand. Sophia's expecting us. She's prepared the spare room, the one with the window facing the sea. And she's baking your favorite, almond cake with orange blossom water. Clara's breath caught. Sophia, her childhood friend who'd chosen a simple life as a botanist, tending community gardens while Raphael built empires. The woman who'd warned her before the wedding. He sees horizons. You see roots. Both are necessary, but they rarely share the same map. As they walked toward the cottage nestled in the grove's heart, Clara paused one last time, turning to face the mansion fully. She didn't see a prison or a trophy. She saw a beautiful, tragic monument to a love that had mistaken possession for partnership. And in that moment, she made a silent promise, not to the man who'd exiled her, but to the land that had sheltered her family for generations. I will listen now. I will remember. Inside Sophia's sun-drenched kitchen an hour later, the scent of baking cake wrapping around her like an embrace, Clara finally allowed herself to unravel completely. Sophia said nothing as she placed a steaming mug of chamomile before her. Just sat beside her, shoulder to shoulder, as Maria had done beneath the olive tree. He kicked you out? Sophia finally asked, her voice gentle but edged with the fury of a woman who'd watched her friend diminish over 10 years. Not with shouting or cruelty, Clara whispered, staring into the tea's golden depths. With words polished to surgical precision. He said I'd become the living embodiment of his insecurities. That my silence confirmed his fear of being seen as a fortune hunter. A tear splashed into the mug. He made me feel like a ghost in my own inheritance. Sophia's hand covered hers. And what did you feel when you walked away? Clara looked up, surprised by the question. Lighter, as if I'd been carrying a stone in my chest for years and only realized its weight when I set it down. She touched the locket at her throat, Abuela's photograph warm against her skin. I kept waiting for devastation, but all I feel is clarity, like waking from a long dream where I played a role written by someone else. Sophia squeezed her hand. That's not devastation, Clara. That's grief for the marriage you thought you had. The real devastation would be staying and forgetting who you are. She rose to check the cake, her movements calm and certain. Raphael built a kingdom on your land, but never learned its language. He measured its value in square footage and resale potential. You measured it in memories and seasons. Neither is wrong, but they cannot share the same roof. As the cake's aroma filled the kitchen, sweet, nutty, redolent of childhood, Clara felt the first fragile shoot of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not hope for reconciliation, but hope for herself. For the woman who sketched wildflowers and understood soil and remembered promises whispered into earth. Later, lying in the spare room with moonlight painting silver stripes across the floorboards, Clara opened her grandmother's letters once more. By candlelight, she read Abuela's words again. When they try to bury you, remember, you are seeds, not stones. What they mistake for an ending is merely the dark before roots reach deeper. Outside her window, the wind rustled the olive leaves, a sound like pages turning. And Clara, for the first time since dawn, slept without dreams of marble floors or glass walls. She dreamed of soil, of roots, of a boundary stone waiting patiently in the grove. And in her dream, the stone began to glow with a soft golden light, not with anger or vengeance, but with the quiet certainty of truth finally ready to surface. Somewhere beyond the cottage walls, a night bird called once, twice, a signal passing between earth and sky. The rose quietly wrapped herself in Abuela's quilt and carried her grandmother's wooden box to the kitchen table, where a single oil lamp cast a honeyed glow across worn pine. Sophia entered moments later, 2 mugs of steaming tea in hand. "You've been staring at that box since sunrise," she said softly, setting a mug beside Clara. "What's inside besides letters?" Clara's fingers trembled as she lifted the lid. "Everything Abuela left me about the land. Deeds, maps, journals. I haven't opened it since the reading of her will. Raphael handled all the legal transfers. He said it would be simpler." A bitter smile touched her lips. "I trusted him to protect what mattered to me." Sophia sat beside her, shoulders brushing. "Show me." Clara unfolded a brittle map drawn in faded ink, contours of hills, streams, and the distinctive olive grove shaped like a crescent moon. In the corner, Abuela's elegant script noted, "Parcel 7B, Terra Viva, never to be severed from family blood." Beneath it lay a notarized deed dated 1948, listing Clara's great-grandmother as sole proprietor. Page after page revealed a meticulous lineage of ownership, each transfer bearing the same stipulation. The land could never be sold, only inherited by direct female descendants. "But Raphael built the mansion legally," Clara whispered, confusion knitting her brow. "He showed me permits, contracts." "Permits to build," Sophia corrected gently, tracing a finger along the deed's border. "Not deeds to own the soil beneath." She pulled a folded document from beneath the others, a land survey commissioned by Abuela weeks before her death. In the margin, a handwritten note made Clara's breath catch. "Clara must understand. The mansion may stand on our land, but the land remains hers alone. Raphael's name appears on construction permits only. The earth remembers its guardian." Rain intensified against the window pane as Clara's hands began to shake. She remembered signing papers in Raphael's study 10 years ago, documents he'd called routine marital property agreements. She'd trusted his explanation without reading the fine print, believing love required surrender. Now she saw the truth. He'd structured everything so the building belonged to his corporation, while the land quietly remained in her name. A detail he'd either overlooked in his arrogance or deliberately ignored, assuming her compliance was permanent. "I never knew," Clara breathed, tears falling onto the parchment. "All these years, I thought I'd given him everything. But Abuela protected the land even from my own willingness to share." Sophia squeezed her hand. She knew men like Raphael, brilliant architects of empires who mistake temporary structures for eternal foundations. Her voice softened. "What will you do with this knowledge?" Clara stared at the rain-streaked window, seeing not glass but the mansion's silhouette against storm clouds. She felt no surge of triumph, only a profound sorrow, for the trust misplaced, for the decades spent believing she'd surrendered her birthright. "I won't use it as a weapon," she said finally, her voice steady with newfound clarity. "But I won't pretend it doesn't exist either. The land has been silent long enough." Later that morning, as rain softened to mist, Clara walked to the community garden Sophia tended on the village outskirts. Kneeling in damp soil between rows of rosemary and sage, she pressed seeds into the earth with fingers that remembered this work from childhood. An elderly gardener named Tomas approached, his hands gnarled like olive roots. "You're Elena's granddaughter," he said, not a question. "I worked this soil. With your abuela. She'd sit right there." He pointed to a weathered bench beneath a lemon tree. "And tell me the land speaks in seasons, not contracts." Clara looked up, soil beneath her nails. "Did she ever speak of the boundary stones? The carvings?" Tomas's eyes crinkled with memory. "She said those stones were witnesses. That when the first olive tree was planted in 1842, your great-great-grandmother pressed her wedding ring into the wet clay of the largest stone. A promise that no building, no king, no sorrow would ever sever this family from its roots." He knelt beside her, pointing to a faint mark on his own wrist, a scar shaped like intertwined branches. "Abuela carved this into my arm when I was 12 after I tried to sell a corner plot to developers. Some truths," she told me, "must be worn on the skin to be remembered." Clara's breath caught. She unfastened her locket, revealing not just Abuela's photograph, but a tiny compartment behind it containing a sliver of clay. The very clay Tomas described, baked hard and dark with age. Abuela had pressed it into her palm the day she died. Keep this close, Mija. When you forget who you are, let the earth remind you. Now, kneeling in the rain-damp soil, Clara understood. The documents weren't weapons. They were echoes. The land hadn't needed papers to know its guardian. It had been waiting patiently for Clara to remember her own voice. That evening, back at the cottage, Maria arrived with a bundle wrapped in burlap. I found this hidden in the library's false bottom drawer, the one only Abuela knew about. She unwrapped it carefully. A leather-bound journal filled with pressed wildflowers and handwritten observations about soil composition, water tables, and seasonal changes across the property. On the first page, Abuela had written, "To my Clara, when the world tries to convince you that land is property, read these pages. Remember, we do not own the earth. We belong to it, and it, in turn, belongs to memory." Clara traced her grandmother's words as dusk settled around them. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean. Through the window, she could just make out the mansion's silhouette against the violet sky. A beautiful, fragile thing perched on soil that had witnessed centuries of love and loss. "I feel her," Clara whispered, tears streaming freely now, not of grief, but of reunion. "Not as a ghost. As a presence in the soil, in the rain, in the roots beneath my feet." Maria placed a weathered hand over hers. "She never left. She waited for you to stop looking for her in photographs and start listening for her in the wind through olive leaves." Clara closed the journal, her resolve crystallizing like dawn light. She would not confront Raphael with documents tomorrow. She would not demand recognition or revenge. Instead, she would walk to the boundary stone at first light and sit with the land as Abuela had taught her. To listen, not to speak. Because the deepest truths, she now understood, reveal themselves not in courtrooms or confrontations, but in the quiet space between heartbeats when a guardian finally comes home. And as moonlight spilled across the journal's pages, illuminating sketches of the very stone where Raphael's expansion plans would soon break ground, Clara felt it, a subtle vibration through the floorboards, up through her bare feet into her bones. Not a tremor of anger, not a threat, but a gentle, insistent pulse, the land awakening, waiting, ready to speak its truth not through yes at dawn, and the silence had grown teeth. He'd thrown himself into work with manic intensity, approving expansion plans for the East Wing with sharp, decisive strokes of his pen. But at 3:17 a.m. each night, he found himself standing at the master bedroom window, staring toward the groves where she'd disappeared, the ghost of her flinch still burning on his skin. On the fifth morning, Elena entered his study without knocking, a breach of protocol that made him look up from blueprints. "Sir," she said, her voice carefully neutral. A certified letter arrived from the County Land Registry office. Marked urgent. He didn't take the envelope immediately. Probably another permit delay. Set it on my desk. "It's not about permits," Elena said softly. "It's a title verification notice. Regarding Parcel 7B. The pen slipped from his fingers, leaving an ink scar across the blueprint's pristine lines. Parcel 7B, the legal designation for the entire property. He'd handled all land acquisition personally a decade ago, navigating bureaucratic labyrinths while Clara, grieving her grandmother's recent death, had signed documents with tear-blurred eyes. He'd assured her it was routine, necessary for the construction loans. "Open it," he commanded, though his throat had gone dry. Elena slit the envelope with a letter opener. Her eyes scanned the single page, and her professional composure fractured. A barely perceptible widening of her eyes, a tightening around her mouth. "What does it say?" Raphael's voice was dangerously calm. "It states that during a routine audit of coastal properties, discrepancies were discovered in the chain of title for Parcel 7B. She looked up, her gaze steady but troubled. Specifically, the registry questions whether the land transfer from Clara's grandmother's estate was properly executed prior to construction commencement. They're requesting documentation proving clear title before approving your East Wing expansion permit." Raphael stood so abruptly his chair scraped against marble. "That's absurd. I have every deed, every transfer document. I handled it all myself." "Then it's a simple matter of providing copies," Elena said, but her hesitation betrayed her doubt. He snatched the letter, scanning the bureaucratic language until his eyes landed on the critical phrase. Preliminary review indicates land ownership may remain vested in original heir despite structural improvements. The words swam before him. He'd structured the deal precisely to avoid this. He'd created a shell corporation to hold the building permits while Clara, in her grief-stricken state, had signed a general property agreement he'd drafted. He'd assumed her inheritance had transferred seamlessly. He'd never actually verified the land deed itself. "Get Henderson on the phone," Raphael barked, pacing toward the window. "Our corporate attorney." Now, as Elena retreated, he stared at the olive groves in the distance, the very spot where Clara had vanished. A cold dread seeped into his bones, unfamiliar and unwelcome. For the first time in 20 years, Raphael felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Henderson's voice crackled through the speakerphone an hour later, stripped of its usual deference. "Raphael, I've reviewed the registry's query. This is unusual. They're citing an obscure clause in the original 1948 deed, a restriction limiting transfer to direct female descendants. Your marriage contract contains a standard marital property clause, but it doesn't explicitly address this specific inheritance restriction." Raphael's knuckles whitened around the phone. "Clara signed everything I put in front of her. She wanted no part in the legal details." "Did she sign a specific land transfer deed?" Henderson pressed. "Not just a general property agreement, but a document explicitly transferring title to the soil itself." Silence stretched thick and suffocating. Raphael remembered Clara sitting at his desk 10 years ago, pale with grief after Abuela's funeral, signing documents without reading them. He'd told her it was necessary to secure construction financing. She'd trusted him completely. He'd never considered that her grandmother might have built protections into the original deed. Protections he'd been too arrogant to investigate. "I'll need to review the original estate documents," Raphael said finally, his voice tight. "There's more," Henderson continued gently. "The registry mentioned a pending inquiry from a Sofia Mendoza, botanist, local resident. She apparently submitted historical land use records suggesting continuous family stewardship predating your development." Sofia, Clara's childhood friend. The woman who'd glared at him during their wedding reception like he was a disease. Raphael ended the call and stood motionless, staring at his reflection in the glass wall. The man staring back wore a $5,000 suit and commanded boardrooms across 3 continents, but his eyes held a flicker of something he hadn't felt since sleeping in his car during architecture school: vulnerability. He picked up his private line, dialing Clara's number, before he could stop himself. It rang 7 times before clicking to voicemail, her voice soft and unchanged. "I'm not available right now. Please leave a message." He hung up without speaking. On the 8th ring an hour later, a different voice answered, Sophia's, cool and unwelcoming. "Clara isn't here," she said before he could speak. "Where is she?" "Where she belongs. Away from men who confuse ownership with love." A pause. "She's gardening. Something you wouldn't understand." "Sophia, this is important. The land registry is doing its job," she interrupted. "For once. Goodbye, Raphael." The line went dead. He stared at the receiver, humiliation burning in his chest. He'd built an empire on the assumption that everything around him, Clara, the land, the mansion, existed because of his will. Now the foundation was cracking, and the woman who held the key to mending it wouldn't even take his call. That afternoon, standing at the East Wing construction site where bulldozers waited to break ground, Raphael knelt and pressed his palm into the soil. He expected cold dirt. Instead, he felt something else, a faint, persistent warmth beneath the surface, like a heartbeat. He jerked his hand back as if burned. Elena approached quietly, holding another envelope. "This just arrived. Hand-delivered." He recognized Clara's handwriting on the front, a looping, elegant script he'd once found charming, now feeling like an accusation. Inside, a single pressed wildflower and a note in that same script. "The land remembers every promise made upon it, even the ones broken. No signature, no demands, just truth, delivered with devastating gentleness." Raphael sank onto the bulldozer's tread, the note trembling in his hand. For the first time, he truly looked at the soil beneath him, not as a commodity to be developed, but as something ancient and alive. He noticed things he'd never seen before. The way the earth darkened near the old well, the faint carvings on the boundary stone half buried in the grove's edge, the stubborn wildflowers pushing through cracks in the construction site's perimeter. He'd spent 10 years building upward, toward the sky. He'd never once looked down. As dusk settled, Raphael remained kneeling in the dirt, the mansion's lights flickering on behind him. A king in his castle, finally understanding he'd been living on borrowed ground. And somewhere beyond the olive groves, a woman who knew the language of roots was waiting for the earth to speak its truth. Stone, not to destroy but to understand. When Elena found him at first light, she didn't comment on his disheveled state. She simply placed a thermos of black coffee beside him and said, "I've taken the liberty of contacting Eleanor Vance." The name struck him like cold water. Eleanor Vance, the most feared property attorney on the coast, a woman who'd dismantled empires over misplaced commas in deeds. He'd avoided her for years, fearing her reputation for brutal honesty. "She won't take my case," Raphael said hoarsely, brushing dirt from his sleeves. "She already has," Elena replied. "I told her the truth, that we may have built a billion-dollar empire on land whose title we never properly verified." She hesitated. "She's meeting us at the registry office in 1 hour." And Raphael. She requested all original documents from Clara's grandmother's estate. Not copies, the originals. The county land registry office smelled of old paper and lemon-scented cleaner. A sterile space where centuries of ownership changed hands with the stroke of a pen. Eleanor Vance waited at a scarred oak table, her silver hair pulled into a severe bun, eyes the color of winter sky scanning documents with unnerving stillness. She didn't rise when Raphael entered. "Sit," she said without looking up. "Explain to me why a man who builds skyscrapers didn't verify the foundation beneath his own home." Raphael slid into the chair opposite her, the ghost of Clara's pressed wildflower still tucked in his breast pocket. "I handled the land acquisition personally. Clara's grandmother passed away shortly before we married. Clara was grieving. I managed the paperwork to ease her burden." Eleanor finally looked up, her gaze stripping away decades of practiced confidence. "Did you read the original 1948 deed before drafting your marital property agreement?" "I reviewed the transfer documents. The original deed," she interrupted, sliding a brittle parchment across the table. "Not the transfer. The source." Raphael's throat tightened as he scanned the elegant script. There it was, Section 7, Clause B. "This land shall pass solely to direct female descendants of the bloodline, never to be severed from familial stewardship through sale, mortgage, or marital conveyance without explicit written consent of the current guardian." At the bottom, Abuela's signature flourished beside a wax seal bearing the intertwined olive branches. "I never saw this," Raphael whispered. "Clara's estate attorney provided standard transfer documents." "Because her grandmother never transferred it," Eleanor said softly, the first hint of pity in her voice. "She left it to Clara with these restrictions intact. Your marital property agreement contains a clause stating Clara relinquishes all interest in real property acquired during marriage. But it never addressed premarital land held under restrictive covenant." She tapped the deed. "This land was never acquired during marriage. It was inherited before vows were spoken. It remains Clara's alone." Raphael's hands trembled as he reread the clause. 10 years of certainty crumbled in 60 seconds. He'd built his identity on owning this land, had introduced himself at galas as the man who transformed worthless scrub into a masterpiece, all while standing on soil that legally, spiritually, emotionally belonged to the woman he'd exiled. "Can we challenge the covenant?" he asked, voice tight. "Argue it's archaic? Unenforceable?" Eleanor's smile was thin and sharp. "You could, but I've researched Clara's grandmother, Isabella Mendoza. Formidable woman. She anticipated this. The covenant was upheld in 1972 when a developer tried to claim adverse possession. The court ruled the land possesses a continuity of stewardship transcending conventional property law." She leaned forward. "Raphael, you didn't just marry a woman. You married into a legacy. And legacies, unlike corporations, don't dissolve when convenient." The office door opened. A young clerk approached Eleanor with a sealed envelope. "Additional records requested by Sofia Mendoza, filed this morning." Eleanor opened it, her eyebrows rising slightly as she scanned the contents. She slid a black and white photograph across the table to Raphael. It showed a young Isabella Mendoza standing beside the boundary stone in 1953, one hand pressed against the carved olive branches, the other holding a document bearing the county seal. On the back, in faded ink, "The land speaks through its guardian. No signature can silence its voice." "Who is Sofia Mendoza to you?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Clara's childhood friend. A botanist. A botanist who filed 3 separate historical land use affidavits with the registry this week, Eleanor corrected, documenting continuous family cultivation since 1842. She's not attacking you, Raphael. She's testifying for the land. Raphael stared at Isabella's fierce eyes in the photograph, eyes he'd seen reflected in Clara's when she spoke of soil composition and well water. He'd mistaken her reverence for sentimentality. He dismissed her connection to this place as nostalgia, all while building his empire on a truth he'd been too arrogant to see. "I need to speak with Clara," he said, rising abruptly. "Not through lawyers. Not through Sophia. Face to face." Eleanor didn't stop him. "She's at the community garden this morning." "But Raphael," she waited until he turned at the door. "Don't go there as a billionaire seeking to reclaim property. Go as a man who finally understands he was never the owner, only the guest." The community garden bloomed in riotous color beneath a gentle sun, rows of lavender, rosemary, and sage tended by weathered hands. Raphael found Clara kneeling between tomato plants, her hair loose around her shoulders, dirt smudged on her cheek. She didn't look up as he approached, but her hands stilled on the soil. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly, still tending a seedling. "I know." He stood at the garden's edge, suddenly aware of his expensive shoes crushing delicate herbs. He stepped back onto the path. Eleanor Vance confirmed it. "The land is yours. Legally, completely." Clara finally looked up, her eyes holding no triumph, only sorrow. "I know. You knew before you left. I discovered the documents 3 days after you asked me to go." She rose slowly, wiping her hands on her trousers. "But I didn't come to you with them. I waited for the land to speak first." "The land doesn't speak, Clara. It's dirt and stone." A gentle breeze stirred the lavender around them, carrying its perfume like a sigh. Clara knelt again, pressing her palm flat against the soil. After a long moment, she looked up at him, tears glistening but not falling. "Press your hand here." Not as an architect assessing foundation integrity, as a human being feeling earth. Hesitantly, Raphael knelt beside her, ignoring the mud staining his trousers. He placed his palm beside hers on the warm soil. At first, he felt only dirt. Then, a faint vibration, subtle as a heartbeat. A warmth that shouldn't exist in shaded earth. He jerked his hand back. "What was that?" "The water table," Clara said softly. "This spot sits above an underground spring Abuela mapped in 1967. The land doesn't speak in words, Raphael. It speaks in pulses, in seasons, in the way roots find water no surveyor can detect." She cupped soil in her hands, letting it trickle through her fingers. "You built your mansion on this spring. You never knew because you never asked the earth what lived beneath your foundation." Raphael stared at his soiled palm, the architect in him calculating structural implications. The spring could compromise foundation integrity over time. But beneath the calculation, something deeper stirred: shame. For 10 years he'd walked these grounds seeing only what he'd built, blind to what had always been there. "I thought ownership meant control," he whispered, the confession tearing from him raw and unvarnished. "I thought if I owned the land, I could shape it to my vision. But I never owned it. I just occupied it." Clara's eyes softened. Occupation ends when the guardian returns. Stewardship continues across generations. She stood, offering a hand, not to pull him up, but to help him rise with dignity. "The registry will send formal notice within days. The East Wing expansion cannot proceed without my consent." He took her hand, her skin rough with garden soil, his smooth with privilege. The contrast felt like judgment and absolution simultaneously. "What do you want from me, Clara?" he asked, the question hanging between them like a seed waiting to be planted. She looked toward the distant mansion, its glass walls glittering in the sun, a beautiful, fragile thing perched on ancient earth. "I don't want the mansion. I don't want revenge." Her gaze returned to him, clear and steady. "I want you to understand why Abuela carved those olive branches into the boundary stone. Not as a claim of ownership, but as a promise that some things are held in trust, not possession. And trust," she said softly, "can be broken. But it can also be rebuilt if the one who broke it learns to listen." She turned to leave, then paused. "The spring beneath your foundation, it's been flowing for 10,000 years. Longer than any empire. Longer than any marriage. It doesn't care about deeds or titles. It only cares whether those who walk above it honor its existence." She looked back at him, the ghost of their first love flickering in her eyes. "Learn to listen, Raphael. Not to me. To the land. That's where you'll find the truth you've been building your entire life to avoid. She walked away, leaving him kneeling in the garden's soil. A king without a kingdom, finally understanding that the most powerful foundations aren't made of concrete and steel, but of humility and memory. And as the sun climbed higher, warming the earth beneath his knees, Raphael pressed his palm into the soil, once against the earth, as if afraid the pulse would vanish if he broke contact. The vibration was subtle, a rhythm slower than a human heartbeat, deeper than machinery, ancient as tides. He closed his eyes and for the first time in 10 years stopped calculating, stopped building, stopped owning. He simply felt. And in that stillness, memories surfaced not as recollections but as wounds. Clara at 28, standing barefoot on this very soil the day he proposed. My grandmother says roots here go deeper than any foundation you could build. They remember droughts that cracked stone and rains that washed whole villages away. He'd laughed, sweeping her into his arms. Then we'll build deeper. I'll design footings that reach bedrock. She'd smiled sadly. Some roots don't need to reach bedrock, Raphael. They already touch it. Clara at 32, watching workers pour concrete for the infinity pool. That old well in the East Garden. Abuela said its water tastes of almonds because of minerals no surveyor has mapped. He'd waved a dismissive hand without looking up from blueprints. We'll cap it. Municipal water is safer. She'd gone quiet for days afterward. He'd assumed she was sentimental. He never asked why. Clara last winter, tracing the boundary stone's carvings with her fingertips. These marks aren't decorative. They're a language. The curve here shows where the spring flows beneath us. The notch there marks the solstice sunrise. He'd kissed her temple absently. Fascinating, my love. Now come inside. The contractors need my signature. He'd called her reverence quaint. Her knowledge charming but impractical. He'd built an empire on the assumption that love meant sharing his vision, never considering she might have her own, and that her vision was older, deeper, more permanent than any structure he could design. Sir? Elena's voice pulled him back to the present. She stood at the garden's edge, holding his phone. You've missed 3 calls from the Singapore investors, and Henderson needs your signature on the revised expansion plans by noon. Raphael didn't move. Cancel the Singapore call, and tell Henderson the expansion is on indefinite hold. Elena's professional mask cracked. Indefinite hold? Raphael, the foundation work begins tomorrow. The investors can wait. He finally rose, soil clinging to his knees like accusations. I need you to do something for me, Elena. Something I should have asked you to do 10 years ago. She waited, wary. Find every photograph, every video, every document from our first year here. Before the mansion existed. When it was just the farmhouse and the olive groves. His voice broke on the last word. I need to see what I walked away from when I chose to build upward instead of looking down. That evening, Raphael sat alone in the mansion's media room as Elena's curated collection played across the screen. A ghost story of his own making. There was Clara at 29, kneeling in the East Garden with Abuela's trowel, showing him how to test soil moisture by squeezing a handful. See how it holds shape but crumbles gently? That's the land saying it's ready to receive. He'd nodded impatiently, already sketching foundation lines in his notebook. There she was again, barefoot in the rain, laughing as she pressed his palm against the boundary stone. Feel that warmth beneath the surface? That's the spring moving. The land's heartbeat. He'd pulled his hand away, wiping it on his trousers. We'll need to reroute that water table before pouring footings. And there, oh God there, Clara on their wedding day, standing before the olive grove in her simple ivory dress, turning to him with tears in her eyes. This land has held my family through wars and droughts. Today it holds our promise. He'd kissed her, whispered forever, then immediately turned to discuss tent placement with the event planner. He'd been present in every frame, but absent in every moment. He'd built a life with a woman while remaining blind to the world she inhabited, a world of roots and springs and stones that remembered centuries. He'd mistaken her silence for agreement, her deference for admiration, her patience for passivity. All while she watched him build a monument to his ambition on sacred ground, saying nothing because she believed love meant giving space for his dreams to grow. The screen went dark. Raphael sat in silence, the weight of his blindness crushing his chest. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the olive groves, now silvered by moonlight. Somewhere out there, Clara slept beneath a roof she hadn't designed, surrounded by plants she understood, finally free of the gilded cage he'd mistaken for a gift. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Maria stood in the doorway, holding a tray with 2 cups of tea, chamomile, Clara's blend. "She asked me to bring this to you," Maria said quietly, setting the tray on the piano. "Said you'd been kneeling in the garden all afternoon. That you might need reminding that even stone softens with patience." Raphael stared at the steaming cups. Why would she do this? After what I said to her? Maria's eyes held no judgment, only sorrow. Because she sees the boy who sketched buildings on napkins beneath the man who builds empires. She sees what you've forgotten, that every foundation begins with a single stone laid with intention. She moved to the window, gazing toward the groves. "Do you know why Abuela insisted the boundary stone remain exactly where it stood in 1842? Not moved an inch for construction." Raphael shook his head. "Because the stone marks where the first olive tree took root after the great drought of 1841. A single seed carried by wind, finding purchase in cracked earth when nothing else could grow." Maria turned to him, her voice soft but firm. "Your mansion stands because that stone held its ground through fire and famine. You built upon resilience you never bothered to understand." Tears welled in Raphael's eyes, hot, shameful, long overdue. "I thought I was giving her everything. A life beyond this dirt road. Security. Status. I thought she'd thank me for lifting her from this place." Maria's gaze softened. "She never wanted to be lifted from this place, Raphael. She wanted you to kneel beside her in the soil and see what she saw." She touched his arm, her hand rough with decades of work. "Pride builds monuments. Humility builds homes. You've spent 10 years building a monument. It's not too late to learn how to build a home." She left him alone with the tea and the moonlight. Raphael picked up 1 cup, the warmth seeping into his palms. The same warmth he'd felt in the garden soil. He walked to the terrace doors and stepped outside, barefoot now, feeling the cool stone beneath his feet. He walked past the infinity pool, past the manicured lawns, until he stood at the edge of the wild olive groves where Clara had vanished days ago. And he knelt, not as a billionaire assessing property, not as an architect evaluating terrain, but as a man finally understanding he'd been a guest in a sacred place, mistaking hospitality for ownership. He pressed his palms into the earth and waited. At first, nothing. Then a vibration, faint but unmistakable. A rhythm that had pulsed here long before his first blueprint, that would pulse long after his mansion crumbled to dust. The land's heartbeat. The truth he'd spent a lifetime avoiding. Tears fell freely now, soaking into the soil he'd disrespected for a decade. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words carried away by the night breeze. "I'm so sorry I never listened." A rustle in the olive branches made him look up. Clara stood 10 feet away, wrapped in Abuela's quilt, watching him with eyes that held no anger, only quiet witness. "You feel it now," she said softly. Not a question. He nodded, unable to speak. She knelt beside him, their shoulders almost touching. The land doesn't forgive. It doesn't condemn. It simply waits for those who walk upon it to remember they are part of its story, not its authors. She pressed her palm beside his on the soil. "This pulse you feel? It's been here since before my great-grandmother pressed her ring into the boundary stone. It will be here after we're gone. The question isn't whether you own it, Raphael. The question is whether you're willing to belong to it." He looked at her, really looked, seeing not the quiet wife he'd taken for granted, but a guardian of ancient truths, a woman rooted in something that outlasted empires. And in that moment, his pride didn't shatter. It transformed, like stone worn smooth by patient water, becoming something new, something capable of holding life instead of just reflecting power. "I don't know how to belong," he admitted, voice raw. "I only know how to build." Clara's hand covered his on the soil, her dirt-smudged fingers intertwining with his. "Then learn to build differently. Not upward toward the sky, but downward toward the roots. Not as an owner, but as a steward." She squeezed his hand. "The mansion can stand, but only if its foundation honors what lies beneath." Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, a signal passing between earth and sky. Raphael closed his eyes, feeling the twin pulses beneath his palms, the land's ancient rhythm and Clara's steady heartbeat beside him. For the first time in 10 years, he wasn't building toward a horizon. He was arriving home. And in that arrival, he understood the deepest truth of all, that the most unshakable foundations aren't made of concrete and steel, but of humility, memory, and the courage to kneel when the world expects you to stand tall. Essie with soil-stained cuffs, boots that had known 10 seasons of rain and sun. No silk, no heels, just earth-ready fabric that breathed with her movements. By first light, she stood at the edge of the community garden, a half-acre plot nestled between modest cottages where elders grew vegetables for soup kitchens and children learned to plant seeds with trembling fingers. Tomas, the gnarled gardener who'd spoken of Abuela's wisdom, greeted her with a nod as he uncoiled a hose. "You've come to stay," he said. "Not a question." Clara knelt beside a raised bed of struggling tomato plants, her fingers brushing leaves yellowed by neglect. "I've come to listen." Tomas watched as she pressed her palm into the soil, closing her eyes. After a long moment, she began gently loosening the earth around each plant's base, her movements fluid and certain. "The roots are drowning," she murmured. "Too much water, not enough sun on this side of the plot." She shifted 2 plants to a sunnier bed, amended the soil with compost from a nearby bin, and whispered to each seedling as she worked, a habit Sophia teased her for, but one Abuela had taught her. Plants remember kindness in the hands that touch them. By mid-morning, a small crowd had gathered, not out of curiosity, but need. Mrs. Gable, whose arthritis made bending painful, brought Clara a tray of lemon water. Young Mateo, 7 years old and shy, hovered at the garden's edge until Clara beckoned him over. "Show me your hands," she said softly. He extended small, dirt-smudged palms. "Good. Now close your eyes and press them into the soil beside me. Not to take, to ask." Mateo obeyed, his small fingers sinking into the earth. Clara covered his hands with her own, guiding his touch. "What do you feel?" "Cold," he whispered. "Deeper." He frowned in concentration. "Warm underneath." Clara smiled. "That's the truth hiding beneath the surface. Always there if you're patient enough to feel for it." She guided his fingers to a tiny green shoot pushing through cracked soil. This one was ready to give up. But roots never truly surrender. They just wait for someone to notice their strength. As the sun climbed higher, Clara moved between beds with quiet authority, diagnosing blight on rosemary with a glance, redirecting irrigation channels with intuitive precision, teaching teenagers how to test soil pH using vinegar and baking soda rather than expensive kits. She didn't command. She invited. Didn't instruct. She revealed. At noon, Sophia arrived with baskets of bread and cheese, pausing to watch Clara demonstrate companion planting to a group of skeptical retirees. "Marigolds here," Clara explained, tucking seedlings between tomato plants. "Repel nematodes naturally. No chemicals needed. The land provides its own medicine if we learn." "It's language." Sophia approached quietly, setting down the food. "You're not just gardening, Clara. You're teaching them to see." Clara wiped sweat from her brow with her forearm, leaving a smudge of rich brown earth. "I spent 10 years shrinking myself to fit a world that valued only what could be measured in square footage and stock prices." She looked around at the vibrant chaos of the garden, the imperfect tomatoes, the crooked bean poles, the children laughing as they harvested carrots too small for market but perfect for soup. Here, a crooked carrot is still nourishment. A wilted leaf teaches resilience. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is dismissed as impractical. Sophia squeezed her shoulder. "Raphael called me this morning. He didn't ask for you. He asked about the spring beneath the mansion's foundation. Wanted to know if redirecting it would damage the ecosystem." Clara's hands stilled on a basil plant. "And what did you tell him?" "That some truths must be learned firsthand. That I'm not his translator anymore." Sophia's voice softened. He sounded different. Less certain. More human. Clara nodded slowly, returning to her work. Humility isn't built in boardrooms. It grows in soil, one seed at a time. That afternoon, as Clara taught Mateo how to save seeds from drying sunflowers, the boy's grandmother approached. A woman named Elena, no relation to Raphael's assistant, whose hands were mapped with veins like river deltas. "You have your abuela's hands," the elder said, her voice like wind through dry grass. "I worked this soil with Isabella when I was Mateo's age. She'd kneel exactly as you do now, palms flat, listening before touching." She pointed to a patch of soil near the garden's center. "That spot has always grown the sweetest strawberries. Isabella said it sits above a vein of the same spring that feeds your east garden well." Clara knelt where indicated, pressing her palms into the earth. The vibration was unmistakable, a gentle, persistent pulse that resonated up her arms and into her chest. Tears welled unexpectedly. Not tears of sorrow, but of homecoming. For 10 years she'd carried this knowledge silently, afraid her reverence would be dismissed as sentimentality. Here, in this humble garden, it was recognized as wisdom. She never wanted the land developed, Elena continued softly. But when you brought Raphael here that first summer, she watched him sketching in his notebook and said, "He sees only what he can build. But perhaps love will teach him to see what already exists." The elder's eyes glistened. "She believed in you, Clara. Not in his ambition. In your capacity to awaken his sight." Clara looked around the garden, at Mrs. Gable carefully tying up pea vines, at teenagers sharing water bottles in the shade, at Matteo proudly holding a sunflower seed head twice his size. This was stewardship. Not ownership. Not control. But care that flowed both ways. The land nourishing them honoring the land. "I failed her," Clara whispered. "I let him build without speaking the truth." Elena shook her head firmly. "You didn't fail. You waited. There's a difference. Some seeds need darkness before they can break open. Some truths need silence before they can be heard." She placed a weathered hand over Clara's on the soil. "You're not the woman who left that mansion 3 days ago. You're the guardian returning to her post. The land knows it. We all feel it." As evening approached, Clara stood at the garden's edge watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of rose and gold. The same colors that had greeted her the morning she walked away from the mansion. But now the light felt different. Not an ending, but a beginning. She felt no urge to reclaim the mansion. No desire for revenge or recognition. Only a deep, quiet certainty. She belonged here. Not because she owned this soil, she didn't, but because she understood its language. And in understanding, she'd rediscovered her own voice. Matteo ran up to her, breathless, holding a single perfect strawberry cupped in his palms like an offering. "For you," he said solemnly. "The first one." Clara accepted the berry, its surface dusted with gold. She didn't eat it immediately. Instead, she knelt to his level, their foreheads almost touching. "Do you know why this strawberry is perfect?" she asked. "Because it's red? Because it grew exactly as it needed to, no straighter, no larger, no more or less than the earth asked of it." She placed the berry gently in his hand. "You keep it. And remember, perfection isn't about meeting someone else's design. It's about honoring your own nature." As Matteo ran off to share his treasure, Clara rose and walked to the garden's center, where the spring's pulse was strongest. She removed her boots and socks, pressing bare feet into the cool soil. The vibration traveled up her legs, into her core, a rhythm older than memory, steady as breath. She closed her eyes and for the first time in a decade felt no need to shrink, no need to silence herself, no need to make space for someone else's dream at the expense of her own. She was simply Clara. Guardian. Gardener. Woman rooted in truth. Behind her, the community gathered for evening harvest, laughing, sharing stories, hands stained with earth. Ahead, the olive groves whispered in the twilight breeze, their leaves rustling like pages turning in a story just beginning. And somewhere beyond the groves, a man who had spent a lifetime building upward was finally learning to kneel. Clara didn't know if their paths would cross again. She didn't need to know. What mattered was this: she had returned to herself. And in returning, she had become unshakable. Not Abuela's estate attorney, dated 3 days before her death, stating explicitly, "The land comprising Parcel 7B shall pass solely to Clara Mendoza, with all restrictive covenants intact. No marital property agreement shall supersede this inheritance without Clara's explicit, informed consent witnessed by 2 disinterested parties." His signature appeared nowhere on that document. He drafted their marital property agreement himself during Clara's grief-numbed haze, inserting a clause about shared assets acquired during marriage, while carefully omitting any reference to premarital land held under restrictive covenant. He'd told himself it was efficiency, protection. Now he saw it for what it was: arrogance masquerading as care. "Sir?" Elena's voice came from the doorway, soft with dawn light behind her. The registry office opened early. "I spoke with the senior clerk." Raphael didn't look up from the affidavit. "Tell me." She confirmed the covenant is ironclad. Enforced as recently as 2018 when a developer tried to claim adverse possession on neighboring land. Elena stepped closer, her professional composure fraying at the edges. "Raphael," the clerk mentioned something else. Something not in the public records. He finally lifted his head. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. "What?" Clara never contested the mansion's construction. Never filed a single objection when permits were approved. Elena's voice dropped to a whisper. "Because she trusted you. She believed your love meant you'd honor the land even without legal obligation." She placed a hand on his shoulder, unprecedented familiarity. You didn't just build on her land, Raphael. You built on her trust. And that was always the true foundation. The words landed like stones in still water, ripples spreading through the last vestiges of his pride. He thought of Clara kneeling in the garden the day construction began, pressing his palm against the boundary stone. Feel this warmth? Promise me you'll design around it, not over it. He'd kissed her forehead and said, "Of course, my love," while already sketching foundation lines that would bury the stone beneath concrete footings. He rose unsteadily, the affidavit crumpling in his fist. "I need to see the original deed. The one with Abuela's wax seal. The clerk said it's stored in the county vault. Requires special authorization to view." "Then get it." His voice broke, not with anger but with raw, unvarnished need. "Tell them Rafael Valdez will sign whatever waiver they require. I need to see her signature. I need to see the seal." 2 hours later, Rafael stood in the county vault's sterile chill, staring at the 1948 deed displayed under glass. Abuela's signature flourished across the bottom in bold ink, beside a wax seal bearing the intertwined olive branches Clara had tried to show him 100 times. But it was the marginalia that shattered him, a note in Abuela's hand beside Clause B. "This covenant exists not to restrict, but to protect. Land without memory is dirt. Memory without stewardship is ghost. May my granddaughter find a partner who understands both." A choked sound escaped his throat, half sob, half laugh of devastating irony. He'd kicked his wife out of a mansion built on land she'd inherited to protect its memory, all while believing himself the creator of their shared life. The ultimate humiliation wasn't losing property rights. It was realizing he'd mistaken guardianship for ownership, reverence for sentimentality, and love for possession. "Sir?" The vault clerk approached hesitantly. "There's one more document. Filed yesterday by Sofia Mendoza." She handed him a folder containing soil survey maps dating to 1923, each marked with handwritten notations in Abuela's script. Spring flow consistent. Olive root depth 12 feet. Boundary stone alignment true north. On the final page, a single sentence underlined twice. "The land's voice is in its continuity. Break that continuity and you break the covenant, not legally but spiritually." Raphael sank onto a cold metal bench, the folder trembling in his hands. He thought of Clara's words in the garden. "The question isn't whether you own it. The question is whether you're willing to belong to it." He'd spent a lifetime believing belonging meant control. She'd known all along it meant surrender. His phone buzzed, Henderson's name flashing on the screen. He answered without greeting. "The registry just sent formal notice," Henderson said, voice tight. "They're placing a lien on the property pending title clarification. The East Wing expansion is frozen indefinitely. Investors are panicking." "Let them panic," Raphael said, the words feeling like the first truth he'd spoken in years. "Raphael, this could trigger covenant defaults on your corporate loans. We're talking billions. Then we'll renegotiate." He stood, folding the soil survey maps carefully. "Or we'll lose it all. Either way, the land remains Clara's." Silence stretched across the line. When Henderson spoke again, his voice held something unfamiliar: respect. "I've scheduled a meeting with Eleanor Vance at noon. She wants to discuss options." "There's only one option," Raphael said softly. "I need to speak with Clara. Not through lawyers. Not through intermediaries. Face to face." He found her where Tomas said she'd be. At the old well in the East Garden, the one he'd planned to cap during construction. She knelt beside the stone rim, dipping a clay cup into the water and offering it to young Mateo, who drank with wide-eyed wonder. "It tastes like almonds," the boy whispered. Clara smiled. "Because the water remembers the trees that grew here before your grandparents were born." Raphael approached slowly, stopping 10 feet away as if approaching sacred ground. Clara looked up, her expression neither welcoming nor hostile. Simply present, like the olive trees surrounding them. "You came to see the well," she said. "Not a question." He nodded, throat tight. "I reviewed every document. The deed. The covenant. Abuela's marginalia." He held out the folded soil survey maps. "I see now what I refused to see for 10 years. Clara accepted the maps but didn't open them. Seeing isn't enough, Raphael. Anyone can look at a deed. Stewardship requires feeling the spring beneath your feet and choosing to honor its flow, even when rerouting it would be more convenient." "I know." The admission cost him everything he'd built his identity upon. "I stood in the vault this morning staring at your grandmother's signature, and all I could think was, she knew. She knew I would see only what I could build, not what already existed. And she left the land to you anyway, trusting you to protect it from men like me. Tears glistened in Clara's eyes, but she didn't look away. She trusted me to protect it and to awaken those who walked upon it. There's a difference. Matteo tugged her sleeve. The water's warm today. Clara dipped her fingers into the well, then held them out to Raphael. Feel. Hesitantly, he knelt beside her, their shoulders almost touching. He dipped his fingers into the water and gasped. Warmth radiated from the depths, gentle as a living pulse. Not geothermal. Not mechanical. Something older. The spring flows from a cavern system beneath us, Clara said softly. Abuela mapped it in 1967. She said the water warms when the land is at peace, cools when it's threatened. She looked at him, her gaze holding the weight of generations. It's been cold since the bulldozers arrived last month. Today, it's warm again. Raphael stared at his wet fingers, the warmth seeping into his skin like absolution. He thought of all the times he'd dismissed her reverence as sentimentality. All the times he'd chosen concrete over continuity. And in that moment, the devastating irony of his actions crashed over him. He'd exiled the only person who could hear the land's voice, believing himself the rightful owner of a foundation he'd never truly understood. I told you to leave because I was afraid, he whispered, the confession tearing from him raw and unvarnished. Afraid that your silence confirmed I'd married up. Afraid that without this land, I was nothing but a man who drew buildings on napkins. He looked at her, tears streaming freely now. But you were never silent, Clara. You were waiting, and I was too arrogant to hear you. Clara placed her hand over his where it rested on the well's stone rim. Her touch was neither forgiveness nor condemnation, simply acknowledgement. The land doesn't care about your fear or your pride. It only cares whether you're willing to listen now. She rose, helping Matteo to his feet. Come back tomorrow at dawn. Bring no blueprints, no contracts, just your hands and your willingness to feel. She began walking toward the olive groves, then paused without turning. And Raphael, leave your shoes at the garden gate. The land speaks more clearly to bare feet. She disappeared between the trees, leaving him kneeling at the well's edge, a king stripped of his crown, finally understanding that the most powerful foundations aren't built upon land, but within it. And as the sun climbed higher, warming the stone beneath his knees, Raphael pressed his palm flat against the earth and waited. Not for a document to grant him rights, not for a signature to restore his pride, but for the faint, ancient pulse of truth to rise through his bones, a rhythm older than empires, wiser than ambition, patient enough to wait for even the most arrogant heart to remember how to kneel. The reckoning had arrived not with legal notices or financial ruin, but with warm the olive groves. He'd left his shoes on the stone path as instructed, the cool earth shocking against his soles, soft, damp, alive. For 42 years he'd walked surfaces designed by human hands, marble, concrete, polished wood. Now he felt soil for the first time, not as an obstacle to be conquered, but as a presence. Clara waited beside the well, her back to him, hands resting on the stone rim as if drawing strength from its ancient coolness. She didn't turn as he approached barefoot, each step slower than the last, until he stood 3 feet behind her. Close enough to hear her breathing, far enough to respect her silence. You came, she said finally, still not facing him. I said I would. The land doesn't care about promises kept out of obligation. She turned then, her eyes holding the gray light of early morning. It cares about intention. Why are you here, Raphael? Truly. He opened his mouth to confess, to apologize, to plead, but the words died in his throat. Because the truth was more complicated than any speech could capture. He was here because the mansion felt like a tomb without her. Because investors' panicked calls meant nothing compared to the memory of her palm pressed beside his on warm soil. Because he'd spent a lifetime building monuments to his own ambition, and finally understood he'd been constructing his own loneliness. I don't know, he admitted, the honesty raw and terrifying. I thought I came. To save the mansion. To negotiate. To fix what I broke. He looked down at his bare feet, pale against dark earth. But standing here now, I think I came because for the first time in 10 years, I feel the ground beneath me. Not as property. As home. Clara's expression didn't soften, but something shifted in her gaze, a flicker of recognition. You built a home on my inheritance without ever asking what home meant to me. I know. The admission cost him everything. I thought home was security. Status. A view that proved I'd arrived. He finally lifted his eyes to meet hers. You knew home was the taste of well water, the sound of olive leaves in wind, the certainty that some roots go deeper than any foundation. A breeze stirred the grove, carrying the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine, the perfume of her childhood. Clara closed her eyes briefly, as if gathering strength from the air itself. 3 days ago you told me there was no longer space for me in your life, she said softly. You said my silence confirmed your deepest fear, that you'd married up. Her voice broke on the last word. Do you have any idea what it costs to hear the person you love reduce your reverence to insecurity? To watch him mistake your patience for passivity? Tears welled in Raphael's eyes, but he didn't look away. I was afraid, he whispered. Not of losing the land. Of losing the illusion that I'd built everything myself. Your grandmother's covenant. It meant I hadn't created our life from nothing. I'd been given a foundation I didn't earn. He pressed his palms together as if in prayer. That terrified me more than poverty ever did. Clara stepped closer, close enough that he could see the faint freckles across her nose. The ones he'd once traced with his fingertip during lazy Sunday mornings he'd long forgotten. You were given a foundation, she agreed softly. But foundations aren't gifts to be owned. They're trusts to be honored. Abuela didn't leave me this land so I could profit from it. She left it so I'd remember that some things endure beyond our lifetimes. Love, memory, continuity. Her voice dropped to a whisper. You saw the land as leverage. I saw it as legacy. And you asked me to choose between them. I was wrong. The words weren't enough, but they were all he had. Not legally wrong, though I was that too. Spiritually wrong. I treated sacred ground as real estate. Mateo's voice called from the garden path. Clara, the tomatoes are ready, breaking the fragile space between them. Clara didn't turn toward the boy, but her shoulders relaxed almost imperceptibly. You've changed, she said, not as accusation but observation. The man who kicked me out of our home 5 days ago would never have stood barefoot in dirt at dawn waiting for permission to speak. I'm not the same man, Raphael said, and for the first time the words felt true in his bones. That man believed love meant shaping someone to fit your vision. This man is learning that love means kneeling beside someone and seeing the world through their eyes. Clara finally turned fully toward him, the morning light catching tears she no longer tried to hide. I want to believe you. God, Raphael, I want to believe the boy who sketched buildings on napkins is still in there beneath the billionaire armor. She wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture of self-protection he'd seen 1,000 times, but never understood until now. But my heart is bruised. Not from leaving the mansion. From realizing the man I loved saw my deepest truths as obstacles to his ambition. He took one careful step forward, stopping when she flinched. I'm not asking you to trust me today. Or tomorrow. His voice trembled with vulnerability he'd spent decades concealing. I'm asking for the chance to earn that trust. Not as your husband. Not as the man who owns half a mansion. Just as Raphael. The man who fell in love with a woman who saw magic in soil. Clara studied him. The shadows beneath his eyes, the raw honesty in his posture, the bare feet rooted in earth he'd once dismissed as dirt. She saw the ghost of the man she'd married, yes. But she also saw 10 years of accumulated pride, the slow erosion of partnership into performance, the quiet moments she'd swallowed her truth to preserve his dream. I need time, she said finally, the words carrying the weight of oceans. Not days. Not weeks. Real time. To untangle my love for you from my grief over what we lost. To know whether I'm drawn to you because you've changed, or because I'm lonely. She touched the locket at her throat, Abuela's photograph warm against her skin. The land healed while I gardened these past days. My heart needs that same patience. Raphael nodded slowly, each movement heavy with acceptance. However long you need. No contact, she added gently but firmly. No calls through Elena. No letters delivered by Maria. If you truly want to change, prove it by respecting my space. She turned toward Mateo's voice, then paused. Come back in 30 days. Same time. Same place. Barefoot. A faint, sad smile touched her lips. And bring no expectations. Only your willingness to listen. She walked away without looking back, joining Mateo among the tomato vines where the boy proudly held up a sun-warmed fruit. Raphael remained at the well's edge, the morning sun warming his shoulders, the earth cool beneath his feet. He felt no anger at her conditions. No frustration at the waiting. Only a profound, humbling gratitude that she'd offered a path forward at all. As he turned to leave, His foot brushed against something half buried in the soil, a smooth river stone, worn round by centuries of water. He knelt and picked it up, feeling its weight in his palm. On one side, faint but unmistakable, were two intertwined olive branches carved with delicate precision. Abuela's mark, a boundary stone fragment, displaced during construction but never destroyed. He closed his fingers around it, the stone's coolness seeping into his skin like a promise. For 30 days he would wait, not as a billionaire strategizing his next move, but as a man learning to belong to something greater than himself. And as he walked barefoot back toward the mansion, toward the empty halls and silent rooms, he understood the deepest truth of all, that some foundations aren't built to support structures, but to support souls. And the strongest foundations, like the oldest roots, require not ownership, but surrender. Behind him, Clara watched his retreating figure until he disappeared beyond the garden gate. She didn't wave, didn't call out, but as she turned back to Mateo's eager face, she pressed a hand to her chest where her heart beat a rhythm both wounded and hopeful. The land had spoken. Now it was waiting, not for a reunion, but for a reckoning. And in 30 days, beneath the same dawn sky, two souls would meet again at the well's edge to discover whether broken trust could grow new roots, or whether some fractures ran too deep even for time to heal. The waiting had begun. And in that waiting, the Who watched him with quiet concern. Each morning he walked barefoot to the east garden's edge, stopping precisely at the boundary where Clara had asked him to wait, feeling the earth beneath his feet without crossing the invisible line she'd drawn. On the 17th day, the official notice arrived, not from Clara, but from the County Land Registry office, delivered by certified mail with bureaucratic finality. Raphael sat at the library desk as Elena placed the envelope before him, her hands trembling slightly. "It's an administrative proceeding," she said softly. "Not a lawsuit. The registry is initiating mandatory title regularization after discovering the covenant discrepancy during their audit." Raphael opened the document with steady hands, though his pulse hammered against his ribs. The language was dry, precise. Whereas Parcel 7B remains vested in Clara Mendoza under restrictive covenant. Whereas improvements constructed thereon by Rafael Valdez lack explicit written consent for permanent occupation. The office hereby initiates proceedings to determine lawful occupancy terms pending full title resolution. He read the critical paragraph 3 times before the words settled in his bones. Absent mutually agreed occupancy agreement filed within 45 days, the office may order cessation of unauthorized occupation and restoration of land to pre-improvement condition. Restoration. The word echoed through the silent mansion, a polite legal term for demolition. For erasure. For returning this place to olive groves and wildflowers as if his decade of ambition had never existed. "Schedule a meeting with Eleanor Vance immediately," Raphael said, his voice unnervingly calm. "And contact the registry clerk. We accept their mediation process. No appeals. No delays." Elena hesitated. "Raphael, we could challenge this. Argue good faith improvement. File for prescriptive easement." "No." He looked up, his eyes holding a clarity she'd never seen before. "The land was never mine to claim. If Clara chooses not to grant occupancy rights, then the mansion must fall. That's justice, Elena. Not punishment." The mediation session took place in a sunlit county conference room on day 23, a neutral space smelling of lemon cleaner and old wood. Raphael arrived alone, wearing simple trousers and a cotton shirt, his billionaire armor shed for the first time in memory. He sat at the scarred oak table and waited. Clara entered precisely at 10 a.m., accompanied not by Sophia or a lawyer, but by Tomas the gardener and elderly Elena from the community garden. Witnesses to stewardship, not combatants in a war. She wore a linen dress the color of olive leaves, her hair loose around her shoulders, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She didn't look at Raphael when she sat opposite him. She looked at the county mediator, a woman named Anya with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair. "The purpose today is not to assign blame," Anya began gently, "but to determine lawful terms for occupancy of improvements on land whose title remains vested in Ms. Mendoza under restrictive covenant." She slid 2 documents across the table. Option A, Mr. Valdez purchases full title for fair market value, approximately $42 million based on current appraisals. Option B, Ms. Mendoza grants a lifetime occupancy easement in exchange for annual land stewardship fees and binding restrictions on future development. Raphael's breath caught. $42 million. a sum he could write without blinking 6 months ago. But the markets had turned volatile after news of the title dispute leaked. His stock had dropped 17%. Liquidating assets quickly would mean fire sale prices. He could pay, but at the cost of dismantling everything he'd built. He looked at Clara then, truly looked, and saw not a woman holding a weapon, but a guardian weighing legacy against mercy. Her gaze remained fixed on Anya, but her hands, resting on the table, trembled almost imperceptibly. "May I speak?" Raphael asked quietly. Anya nodded. He turned fully toward Clara.